Grand Blanc Township, Michigan continues.
I mean, the church is basically gone. And you really cannot imagine. It's just burnt down to the bricks. And the unimaginable terror that went on in that place of worship during a church service, it's hard to take in.
As the community grieves, investigators are combing through the wreckage of the church and searching for a possible motive. The 40-year-old gunman and Iraq War veteran Thomas Jacob Sanford had openly declared his hatred for the LDS Church and its followers.
He did make the statement that Mormons are the Antichrist, which is a shocking statement.
Chris Johns is a city council candidate in Burton, Michigan. He says he met Sanford on the campaign trail about a week before the attack.
2 tragedies, 2 different states, 18 days apart. One involving a nationally known political figure, Charlie Kirk, shot during a live event in Utah. The other, a horrifying attack on a religious congregation in Michigan, where families gathered in faith and left in fear. On the surface, these incidents appear unrelated. Separate motives, separate suspects, separate headlines. But as public attention quickly shifted from one story to the next, something changed. The urgency surrounding the Charlie Kirk case began to fade, not because new answers were found, but because a fresh tragedy took center stage. Now people are asking a difficult but necessary question. Was the Michigan church attack purely an isolated act of violence, or did its timing, intentionally or not, serve to redirect focus away from unanswered questions in the Charlie Kirk investigation? Is this simply a coincidence of timing, or did someone benefit from a sudden change in national attention? Please, before we proceed, don't forget to drop your comment as you listening to this new updates. We would appreciate it when you do so, because we will definitely respond to everything. We will be glad to hear your feedbacks on this report and contributions. We stand for justice. We stand for Charlie. This isn't about conspiracy. This is about observation. Media coverage, public conversation, and official updates surrounding Charlie's case declined almost overnight. Key discussions stalled. Leads went quiet. Statements from authorities slowed down. Meanwhile, the Michigan incident rightly drew outrage, headlines, and national grief, yet its impact may have accidentally buried momentum in another case that was just beginning to face public scrutiny. Tonight, we examine that shift. We look at who stopped talking, what stopped being covered, and why people are beginning to question whether distraction, planned or coincidental, can be as powerful as silence. Because when one tragedy overshadows another, accountability can disappear just as quickly as attention. What do you think? Is the case moving forward carefully, or is progress being slowed by procedural delays? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That's when we know where you stand and where you're watching from. To stay updated on every development, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you stay informed as new updates become available. This is Detective Max, and together we stand and fight for justice. In the span of less than 3 weeks, 2 American communities were shattered by violence, each for reasons still clouded by unanswered questions. On September 10th, Charlie Kirk, a nationally recognized conservative commentator, was shot during an event in Utah. The incident sparked outrage, confusion, and immediate debate about motive, security, and silence from key witnesses. Investigations began, but clarity did not follow. Then, before the public could fully process what happened in Utah, another tragedy unfolded on September 28th in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan. A gunman drove into a Latter-day Saints meeting house, opened fire on worshipers, and set part of the building on fire. Families who gathered for faith and community instead faced terror and loss. Authorities labeled the event a possible hate-driven attack, and nationwide coverage surged with urgency. Individually, these stories are heartbreaking. Together, they raise uncomfortable questions that many people are now beginning to voice. Why did national attention surrounding the Charlie Kirk case drop so sharply once the Michigan attack dominated headlines? Was it simply the natural shift of media focus from one tragedy to another, Or did the timing of these events create an opening intentionally or not for the first case to lose its momentum? This investigation doesn't claim a direct connection between the suspects, planning, or motives. Instead, it examines something just as powerful: the effect of timing, public distraction, and how national focus can be redirected so quickly that critical questions go unanswered. In both cases, families are grieving, investigations are ongoing, and facts are still emerging. Yet only one of these tragedies continues to receive consistent coverage. To understand why people are raising new questions, we have to start with the one thing that can't be debated: the timeline. On September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk was shot during a live event in Utah. The suspect, identified and taken into custody, became the focus of immediate headlines. Coverage was intense. Commentators, political leaders, and law enforcement statements flooded national platforms. For several days, the story dominated digital media, news broadcasts, podcasts, and opinion panels. But something subtle happened within the first week: momentum slowed. Updates grew less frequent. Statements became more controlled, and fewer outlets kept the investigation front and center. Questions about motive, involvement, potential accomplices, and witness accounts remained open, but the public conversation began to thin out. Analysts noticed it, viewers noticed it, families and advocates demanded more transparency, but the story was no longer advancing in the news cycle. Then came September 28, 2025. Just 18 days after the Kirk shooting, the nation was shaken again, this time in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan. During a Sunday gathering at a Latter-day Saints meeting house, a man crashed a truck into the building, opened fire, and set part of the structure ablaze. Worshippers were injured and killed, and an entire community was left traumatized. From that moment forward, the media focus shifted almost instantly. The Michigan attack became the leading story across major outlets, with real-time updates, expert commentary, and federal involvement. Press conferences and investigative briefings centered on the suspect's motive, potential hate crime designation, and the scale of the response. And that shift is where the public's questions begin. Because while no one disputes the need for full attention on the Michigan victims and their families, people began noticing what vanished from the national conversation: updates on Charlie Kirk's case. The legal proceedings, the unanswered questions about security, the requests from supporters for new information, coverage that was already slowing suddenly went quiet. This isn't about comparing tragedies or minimizing the loss in Michigan. It's about recognizing that critical attention around the Kirk case began to plateau before the church attack occurred, and was nearly eclipsed altogether once the second tragedy took over the national spotlight. When two major events occur in close succession, focus often shifts naturally. But when that shift benefits those who prefer silence, ignoring the timing becomes part of the problem. The question is not whether both stories deserved attention; they did. The question is why one story lost traction just when public pressure was building. And that leads us deeper into who was speaking, who stopped speaking, and who may have gained from the nation looking the other way. When the shooting involving Charlie Kirk first broke, the media response was immediate and intense. National outlets ran wall-to-wall coverage. Social media platforms flooded with commentary, speculation, and demands for clarity. Political figures issued statements. Debates erupted about motive, ideology, and security failures at public events. For a moment, it looked like this story would stay in the spotlight until answers were found. But by the end of the second week, something changed. Headlines slowed. Editorial panels shifted to other stories. Updates from investigators became shorter, less detailed, and less frequent. The tone of coverage softened from urgent to routine. Then, almost without warning, the Kirk case stopped leading the news altogether. The moment the Michigan church attack occurred on September 28, the national lens rearranged itself instantly. The tragedy in Grand Blanc Township was horrifying, and the coverage reflected that. Live updates, expert panels, investigative briefings, Emotional testimonies and breaking developments dominated news cycles across TV, print, and digital media. Feeds that had previously been flooded with mentions of Utah now focused entirely on Michigan. And this is where public concern started to set in. Was this shift in attention purely organic, just the media doing what it always does when a new tragedy breaks? Or was it something more strategic, something quietly taken advantage of? Because while there's no evidence that the two events were connected by motive or planning, the shift in coverage created an undeniable result. The unresolved questions surrounding the Charlie Kirk case faded from view. Many in the public noticed the change and voiced it openly, online in comment sections, in community forums, and on independent platforms. People began asking why critical details about Charlie's shooter, motive, witness statements, and digital evidence were no longer being updated. Families and supporters questioned why court proceedings and investigative timelines were suddenly moving in silence. It wasn't that the Michigan tragedy didn't deserve attention, it absolutely did. The problem, people argue, is that the Kirk case was already losing coverage before the second tragedy even occurred, and the new event simply finalized the drop-off. That timing has raised suspicion, especially among those who believe the lack of transparency around the Utah investigation benefits someone, whether politically, legally, or financially. So the question isn't just did the media move on, it's who benefited from them moving on. Was this just the natural rhythm of news cycles, or did someone seize an opportunity when the nation's attention was pulled in another direction? In a world where silence can be as powerful as a statement, distraction, intentional or not, can become its own kind of strategy. And for many watching closely, the frustration comes from exactly that, a case full of unanswered questions, pushed into the background before those questions could be addressed. Violent acts don't always share the same motive, but they often share the same impact: fear, outrage, and disruption. In these two cases, the ideological undercurrents, whether proven, assumed, or speculated, played a major role in how the stories were framed and how quickly narratives formed around them. In the Charlie Kirk shooting, investigators have not publicly confirmed a political motive, but the public conversation immediately went there. Supporters pointed to Kirk's visibility as a conservative figure. Critics spoke cautiously, waiting for more information. Media outlets wrestled with how directly to address the possibility of targeted political violence. As a result, narratives began forming before facts were fully established. That framing made the story even more sensitive. Then, before that conversation could evolve or deepen, a second tragedy emerged. In the Michigan church attack, the suspected motive was quickly tied to religious hostility. Reports surfaced about long-standing resentment toward the LDS faith. Law enforcement began investigating potential hate crime classification. Religious communities responded with shock and solidarity. Both cases carry themes that strike at core elements of American identity: speech, belief, ideology, and belonging. They involve spaces where people expect safety: a stage, a church, a community hall, and yet one case received immediate political framing, while the other received immediate religious framing. This difference in narrative treatment shaped how the public understood each tragedy and how long each remained in the spotlight. But here's where it gets more complex. When ideology enters the picture, so does control of the story. Political killings raise questions about influence, rhetoric, security, and accountability, topics that can challenge institutions, parties, and public figures. Religious hate crimes open conversations about protection, bias, community safety, and responses from state and federal agencies. Both are sensitive, both can expose uncomfortable truths. So it's not surprising that many people are now asking whether the drop in coverage around the Kirk case was a convenient pause rather than a natural decline. If a politically sensitive investigation loses attention before answers surface, who benefits? If a religiously targeted attack dominates headlines, who controls the narrative that follows? No one is claiming collaboration between the suspects or proof of a shared motive. That's not the point. The concern is about timing, framing, and how public focus can be shaped, intentionally or not, by who speaks, who stays quiet, and which story is allowed to continue. In the end, both incidents highlight a growing unease that stories involving ideology, belief, or politics don't just unfold, they're managed. And sometimes managing a narrative can be as influential as solving a crime. In every national tragedy, the human cost is the anchor, the part that can't be spun, redirected, or debated away. Faces, families, conversations that will never happen again. That reality exists in both of these cases, but the way those stories were carried or dropped says a lot about what the public was allowed to keep seeing. In the Charlie Kirk shooting, the immediate focus was on motive and justice, but less on the people directly impacted, those who were present, those who witnessed the chaos, and those who have stayed largely silent since. Some attendees have not spoken publicly at all. Families and close contacts released brief statements, then stepped back. Whether this silence was advised, voluntary, or circumstantial remains unclear, but the result was a quieted emotional anchor. Without consistent updates, the conversation around the victims lost its urgency. In Michigan, the emotional impact was immediate and widespread. The attack took place in a sacred space, involving worshipers of all ages. Families spoke, community leaders gathered, religious networks responded. The grief was public and raw, and the story remained centered on the people harmed. No one disputes that the Michigan victims deserved every ounce of national attention, but observers noticed something else. The emotional narrative around the Kirk case was never allowed to evolve. Before personal testimonies could resurface and deepen public engagement, a new tragedy occupied that space. This isn't about competition, it's about erasure by default. When one story fades too fast, justice can lose momentum. When the human details disappear, so does public pressure. And when silence settles in around open questions, answers become easier to delay. People aren't just asking what happened in Utah or Michigan, they're asking why one group of impacted voices was amplified, while the other was allowed to fade into background noise. Silence doesn't always mean nothing is happening behind the scenes, but it often means the public is no longer being invited to care. And in cases like these, silence can become its own kind of narrative. When major acts of violence occur, the public looks to law enforcement for clarity, accountability, and communication. But in both of these cases, the handling of information has raised questions, not just about what is known, but about what is being withheld, delayed, or deprioritized. Following the Charlie Kirk shooting in Utah, officials initially moved quickly. A suspect was detained, charges were filed, and limited statements were released. But soon after, details slowed to a crawl. Key updates about digital evidence, communication records, potential accomplices, or ideological motives were either not shared or significantly minimized. Court dates were mentioned, then not discussed again. Security footage from the event was referenced, but never shown publicly. Witnesses who could provide crucial first-hand accounts have remained out of view, whether by instruction, caution, or choice. People began to ask, is the public being intentionally kept at arm's length? And if so, why? Just over 2 weeks later, in Michigan, authorities responded to the LDS church attack with visible urgency. Federal agencies became involved, community briefings were held, and investigative findings were shared in real time, sometimes even before verification was complete. Debates began immediately about hate crime designation, mental state, and prior threats. The flow of information was active, not paused. Again, no one disputes that the Michigan case warranted a strong response. But the contrast has drawn attention. Why did one case move into media silence so quickly, while another remained open and actively discussed? And then another concern surfaced: resources. Were investigative efforts, personnel, or public relations coordination redirected from the Kirk case when the Michigan attack occurred? Did the shift in narrative also create a shift in investigative transparency? Even without intentional suppression, when coverage drops, scrutiny drops with it. And when public scrutiny fades, responsibility becomes easier to manage behind closed doors. People are not claiming coordinated cover-ups. They're asking whether the natural rhythm of crisis response is being used, intentionally or unintentionally, to bury one story beneath another. In the end, the issue isn't whether officials are working behind the scenes. It's whether the public still has visibility into that work. Because when investigations become quiet too quickly, accountability becomes optional. And in high-profile cases, silence is rarely neutral. It usually serves someone. When authorities withhold details or allow updates to go quiet, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. That's exactly what happened after coverage of the Charlie Kirk case began to fade. People didn't stop caring. Information simply stopped flowing. Online discussions started raising questions. Why were certain witnesses not interviewed publicly? Why were digital records not revisited in the media? Why did surveillance footage vanish from conversation after being briefly mentioned? Some asked whether the shooting was politically motivated, and if naming that motive would have consequences for institutions or individuals. Others wondered if there were communications or affiliations around the suspect that didn't align with the narratives some outlets were comfortable covering. Then the Michigan church attack occurred, and a very different type of transparency took over. Officials gave near-daily updates. News outlets repeated names, ages, timelines, and investigative findings. Religious motive was addressed openly. Emotional interviews surfaced quickly. The conversation never had time to stall. The key distinction isn't how people died, it's how the stories lived afterward. Speculation around the Kirk case grew not because people wanted to invent theories, but because the available facts stopped expanding. Meanwhile, speculation in the Michigan case didn't have time to dominate because verified information kept coming. And yet, responsible observers are being careful. They aren't claiming a shared perpetrator, organized plot, or confirmed link between the two events. They're pointing to something more subtle, the way silence in one case and saturation in another shaped what the public was allowed to keep questioning. The real challenge is separating what is known from what has been shelved. And when the facts no longer drive the story becomes whatever fills the silence. Speculation may not be evidence, but it is always a reaction to missing answers. And in this situation, the missing answers didn't come from the public. They came from the moment coverage stopped. When two major tragedies occur within the same month, it's easy to chalk the shift in attention up to timing. But timing isn't neutral, especially when one story was already losing visibility before the other emerged. Some observers are now asking a question that makes many people uncomfortable. Was the Michigan church shooting, intentionally or not, a public distraction from the unanswered questions surrounding the Charlie Kirk case? To be clear, this theory does not claim coordination between suspects or shared planning. The issue isn't about who carried out the attacks, but about who benefited from the way attention moved. The Charlie Kirk case was at a critical stage when national focus began to fade. The shooter had been identified. Legal conversations were forming. Public scrutiny was building. Questions about motive, affiliations, and security failures were beginning to reach a wider audience. Then, almost overnight, that scrutiny disappeared. When the Michigan tragedy struck, news coverage made a full pivot. For many, it felt like someone had changed the channel on an unresolved investigation. And that's where the theory of distraction enters, not as a proven explanation, but as a practical outcome. Even if the Michigan attacker had no awareness of the earlier shooting, the effect was the same. The Kirk case lost momentum, pressure eased, and media conversations fell silent. Those who preferred the Utah investigation to cool off didn't need to act, they just needed the public to look elsewhere. There's also another angle: exploitation. A tragic event doesn't need to be planned as a diversion to be used like one. Once the focus shifted, it stayed there. No major outlets attempted to bridge the two timelines. No follow-ups revisited Charlie's case in the context of what was left unfinished. The silence wasn't accidental, it was convenient for someone. Is that proof? No. But is it worth asking why a story with national implications was effectively buried by proximity to another crisis? Yes. This isn't about minimizing one tragedy to elevate another. It's about acknowledging that public attention is not infinite, and when it's redirected at the exact moment accountability might rise, distraction becomes more than coincidence. It becomes a shield. The question isn't whether the Michigan attack was created to overshadow the Kirk case. The real question is who stopped talking once it did. Despite the silence in mainstream coverage, not everyone has moved on. Across digital platforms, community forums, independent outlets, and local networks, people are still asking about the Charlie Kirk case, and they're not satisfied with how quickly the trail went cold. Supporters, commentators, and eyewitnesses have raised the same concerns repeatedly. Why did updates stop? Why weren't investigative findings made public? Why did momentum vanish before the story reached resolution? Some legal analysts have questioned whether the slowdown signals a pending development, like sealed evidence, undisclosed cooperation, or broader implications. Others believe the absence of information suggests pressure from individuals or entities who would rather not see the case stay in the spotlight. At the same time, voices demanding justice for the victims in Michigan remain strong and organized. Faith leaders, families, and local officials continue to push for full transparency and accountability. Their advocacy is consistent, public, and unwavering. But there's a growing divide in public sentiment. Supporters of both communities feel that one tragedy absorbed the oxygen from another, and that neither deserves to be sidelined in service of convenience, politics, or narrative control. Petitions, commentary threads, and independent podcasts have attempted to bring the Kirk case back into public view. Some ask for follow-up hearings. Others want clear statements from investigators. Many just want confirmation that the case is still active and not buried behind bureaucratic walls. What ties these voices together isn't ideology, it's frustration. People don't forget when they're paying attention. They forget when the story is taken away. And now, more than ever, citizens are beginning to question whether silence is a symptom of strategy, not closure. Their message is simple: both tragedies deserve truth, and neither should disappear just because another took its place. In the span of just 18 days, two devastating acts of violence unfolded in two different states, one involving a high-profile public figure, the other targeting a faith community in a place of worship. Both should have remained at the center of public attention. Both deserved full investigations, ongoing coverage, and accountability. But that's not what happened. The Charlie Kirk shooting began as a national story, then fell silent before the public ever received clarity. The Michigan church attack dominated headlines immediately, and in doing so, it shifted the national focus entirely. Again, the issue isn't whether the Michigan tragedy warranted attention. It absolutely did. The issue is what was left behind when the spotlight moved. No one is claiming coordination between the perpetrators. There is no evidence of shared planning. But timing has power. Silence has impact. And distraction, whether accidental, exploited, or convenient, can bury the truth just as effectively as denial. What remains now are two parallel realities. One story no longer gets questions. The other has not yet produced answers. Until both are revisited, with equal urgency and transparency, the public is left to navigate uncertainty alone. And when information disappears, so does trust. This investigation is not about placing blame where it hasn't been earned. It's about refusing to let any case vanish, because another took its place. Accountability doesn't run on a one-story-at-a-time schedule. The goal isn't controversy, it's clarity. Because the moment we allow silence to decide what matters, truth becomes negotiable. And when truth becomes negotiable, justice does too. This isn't the end of the story. It's the reminder that the story isn't finished.